Everyone thought they knew the Rat Pack, the parties, the women, the power. But nobody knew about the secret that was slowly killing Frank Sinatra from the inside. Nobody except Dean Martin. And on one snowy December night in Vegas, when Frank was at his lowest point, the king of cool did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. He made the toughest man in show business weep like a baby. Picture December 9th. The Sands Hotel and Casino was at the height of its power. The Copa room was packed with high rollers, Hollywood royalty, and enough mob money to buy a small country. Frank Sinatra was the undisputed king of this glittering kingdom. He commanded respect from presidents, struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, and could fill any room in Vegas with a single phone call. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the dynamics of the Rat Pack. They weren't just entertainers who happened to be friends. They were a brotherhood forged in the crucible of fame, bound together by shared experiences that nobody else could understand. The pressure, the scrutiny, the constant performance both on and off stage. But even within this tight-knit group, there was a hierarchy. Frank was the leader, the one who made the calls, who decided where they went and what they did. Sammy was the talent, the one who could do anything: sing, dance, act, play instruments. Peter was the connection to power, married to JFK's sister, their bridge to Camelot. And Dean? Dean was the soul, the one who kept them grounded, who reminded them who they were beneath all the glitter and spotlight. Frank had always been the most vulnerable of the group, though he hid it behind layers of bravado and carefully constructed toughness. He needed to be needed. He needed to feel indispensable, and that need made him susceptible to people who would exploit it. Ava Gardner had been the master of this manipulation, though Frank was too blinded by obsession to see it. But that night, something was different. Something was wrong. Frank had been drinking more than usual. Not the theatrical drinking he did on stage, where he'd nurse a Jack Daniels for an entire set. This was desperate drinking, the kind that comes from trying to drown something that refuses to die. Dean Martin noticed. Dean always noticed. While Sammy Davis Jr. was dazzling the crowd and Peter Lawford was schmoozing politicians, Dean was watching Frank, really watching him. Beneath that perfectly pressed tuxedo and that million-dollar smile, Frank Sinatra was falling apart. The show had been typical Rat Pack magic. Songs, jokes, casual cruelty disguised as comedy. The audience ate it up. They always did. But when the curtain fell and the spotlight died, Frank didn't head to the bar like he usually did. He didn't go to the high roller tables. Instead, he disappeared. Dean found him 20 minutes later in his dressing room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack Dean could see Frank sitting in front of his mirror, still in full stage makeup, staring at his own reflection with a kind of intensity that borders on madness. "Frankie?" Dean said softly, pushing the door open. Frank didn't turn around. He just kept staring. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his cigarettes. "You ever look at yourself, Dean?" Frank asked, his voice hollow. "I mean, really look?" Dean stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. This wasn't the Frank Sinatra the world knew. This wasn't the chairman of the board. This was just a 50-year-old man from Hoboken, New Jersey, who looked like he'd seen a ghost. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the secret that Frank had been carrying for months. The weight that was crushing him slowly, systematically, like a python around his chest. Ava Gardner was dying. Not literally. Not yet. But their love, their legendary, tempestuous, soul-destroying love affair was finally truly over. The woman who had broken Frank's heart more times than he could count. The woman he had never stopped loving despite 3 marriages and countless affairs, had told him something that shattered his world completely. She had looked him in the eye just 2 weeks earlier and said, "I never loved you, Frank. Not really. You were just convenient." The meeting had taken place at the Chateau Marmont, in the same suite where they'd had their first fight as newlyweds. Frank had gone there with hope in his heart, carrying a new song he'd written for her. He'd imagined a reconciliation, maybe even remarriage. He'd pictured Ava listening to the melody, remembering what they'd once had, choosing love over pride. Instead, she had been cold. Clinical. She'd ordered room service without asking what he wanted, poured herself a martini without offering him one, and treated him like an unwelcome salesman interrupting her evening. "Why did you come here, Frank?" she'd asked, not looking up from her magazine. "I miss you," he'd said simply. "I miss us." That's when she'd laughed. That bitter, cutting laugh that could strip paint from walls. Us. Frank, there never was an us. There was you, obsessed and desperate, and there was me, trying to figure out how to use that obsession to my advantage. The words had hit him like physical blows. 20 years of passion. 20 years of believing he had found his soulmate. 20 years of thinking that beneath all the fighting and the drinking and the screaming matches, there was something real, something eternal, gone, erased with surgical precision. Frank hadn't told anyone. How could he? How do you admit that the greatest love story of your generation was a lie? How do you tell the world that the woman who inspired "I've Got You Under My Skin" and "One for My Baby" never really cared? So Frank did what Frank always did. He buried it. He smiled for the cameras. He joked with the boys. He commanded his kingdom. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he was drowning. Dean sat down on the couch across from Frank's chair. He didn't say anything. He just waited. Dean Martin was a master of silence. He knew when to talk and when to listen. And right now, Frank needed someone to listen. "She never loved me," Frank said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Dean leaned forward. "What?"
"Ava. 20 years, Dean. 20 years of my life, and she said I was convenient."
The word hit Dean like a physical blow. Convenient, Frank Sinatra, the most powerful entertainer in the world. Reduced to convenience. "When did she tell you this?" Dean asked. 2 weeks ago, in her hotel room. I went to see her. I don't know what I thought. Maybe we could try again. Maybe we could make it work. Frank's hands were shaking more violently now. He put down his cigarette before he dropped it. "She laughed at me, Dean. She actually laughed. Said I was pathetic for still carrying a torch after all these years." This was the moment. The moment that would define everything that came next. Dean Martin had a choice. He could offer the usual platitudes. He could tell Frank that Ava was wrong, that she was just being cruel, that Frank was better off without her. He could pour Frank a drink and help him forget. But Dean Martin didn't do the usual thing. Dean Martin did something that nobody expected. He told Frank the truth. "You want to know something, Frank?" Dean said, his voice steady and calm. "I never liked her." Frank looked up, surprised. In all their years of friendship, Dean had never criticized Ava, never even hinted at disapproval. He'd watched silently as Frank destroyed himself over and over again for this woman, but he'd never said a word. "I never liked what she did to you," Dean continued. "I watched her string you along for years. I watched her break you down, build you back up, then knock you down again. I watched her turn the strongest man I know into someone I barely recognized. And you know what the worst part was?" Frank shook his head, unable to speak. "You let her. You gave her all the power." Frank Sinatra, who never bows to anyone, who tells off presidents and mob bosses, who built an empire from nothing, turned into a lovesick teenager every time she walked in the room. Dean leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to know what I see when I look at you now? I see a man who's been walking around dead for 20 years, pretending to be alive. I see someone who forgot that he's Frank fucking Sinatra because he was so busy being Ava Gardner's victim." The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank's face was cycling through emotions like a broken neon sign. Shock, hurt, anger. And somewhere underneath it all, the terrible recognition that his best friend was absolutely right. But Dean wasn't finished. He had 20 years of watching his friend suffer, and he was going to say it all. "She didn't make you weak, Frank. You chose to be weak for her. And now you're sitting here still letting her control you, even when she's not in the room, even when she's told you flat out that none of it mattered to her." Frank stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Dean cut him off. "You think love is supposed to hurt? You think if it doesn't destroy you, it's not real. Well, congratulations, pal. You got exactly what you wanted. You got destroyed." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stood there, swaying slightly, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Anger, hurt, confusion, and then something Dean had never seen before. Recognition. My God, Frank whispered. You're right. And that's when it happened. That's when Frank Sinatra, the man who had stared down senators and survived assassination attempts, who had climbed from the gutter to the pinnacle of American culture, started to cry. Not a single tear rolling down his cheek. Not a dignified display of emotion. This was ugly crying. Deep, soul-shaking sobs that seemed to come from a place that had been locked away for decades. Dean stood up and walked over to his friend. He put his hand on Frank's shoulder and said the 5 words that would haunt Frank for the rest of his life. It's okay to be free. Free. The word Frank had never associated with love. Love, to Frank, was prison. Love was chains. Love was giving someone the power to destroy you and hoping they wouldn't use it. But Dean was talking about something else entirely. He was talking about choosing to love someone who loved you back. He was talking about relationships built on respect instead of obsession. He was talking about the radical idea that love should make you stronger, not weaker. Frank cried for 20 minutes. 20 years of pain and confusion and misguided devotion pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. Dean didn't try to stop him. He didn't try to cheer him up. He just stood there, being present, being solid, being the friend that Frank needed. And in that moment, Dean Martin revealed something about himself that the world had never seen. For all his reputation as the cool, detached member of the group, Dean possessed an emotional wisdom that ran deeper than any of them had realized. He understood that sometimes the greatest act of friendship isn't comfort, it's confrontation. Sometimes love means holding up a mirror, even when the reflection is ugly. When the tears finally stopped, Frank sat in the chair like a deflated balloon. His makeup was ruined, his hair disheveled, his tuxedo wrinkled. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he looked real. How do you do it? Frank asked, his voice hoarse from crying. How do you make it look so easy? Dean smiled, that lazy, knowing smile that had charmed millions. But there was something different about it now, something gentler. It is easy when you stop trying to control it, when you stop thinking love is supposed to hurt. But how do you know the difference? Frank pressed. How do you know if it's real or if you're just fooling yourself again? Dean sat back down, considering the question seriously. Real love doesn't make you smaller, Frank. It makes you more yourself, not less. It doesn't ask you to beg or grovel or prove yourself every day. It just is. That night changed everything. Not immediately. Frank didn't wake up the next morning completely healed. But something had shifted. The hold that Ava Gardner had on his soul had been broken. Not by anger or resentment, but by a simple truth. He deserved better. Over the following months, Frank began to change. He stopped calling Ava. He stopped writing letters he never sent. He stopped organizing his entire emotional life around a woman who had never been worth the trouble. And for the first time in 20 years, Frank Sinatra started to live for Frank Sinatra. The irony is beautiful and tragic. The world thought Dean Martin was the cold one, the detached one, the man who didn't care about anything. But that night in Vegas, Dean showed more emotional intelligence and genuine friendship than anyone else in Frank's life ever had. He didn't enable Frank's obsession. He didn't feed his self-pity. He held up a mirror and forced Frank to see what he had become. And then, when Frank finally broke down, Dean was there to catch him. This is the story they don't tell you about the Rat Pack. This is the story of real friendship, not the manufactured camaraderie for the cameras, not the publicity stunts and party pictures. This is the story of one man saving another man's soul with nothing but honesty and presence. Frank Sinatra went on to have other relationships. He married Barbara Marx in 1976 and found something resembling peace. But he never forgot that night in Vegas. He never forgot what Dean had given him, permission to stop suffering for love. Years later, when Frank was asked about his friendship with Dean, he said something that revealed everything. Dean taught me that being cool isn't about not caring. It's about caring enough to tell the truth. The truth. Such a simple thing. But in a world built on illusion and image, telling the truth can be the most radical act of love there is. So the next time you hear That's Life or My Way, remember that those songs weren't born from heartbreak. They were born from liberation. They were born from the night Frank Sinatra cried in a Las Vegas dressing room, and Dean Martin taught him how to be free. And if you want to know more stories like this, stories about the real men behind the legend, you're in the right place. The Rat Pack had more secrets than a Swiss bank, and we're just getting started. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because next week we're diving into the night Sammy Davis Jr. saved Dean Martin's life with a single phone call. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. This is the untold legacy. This is the truth behind the tuxedos. And sometimes, the truth is more beautiful than any song they ever sang.